No one warned him. Accepting the flower of an Apache woman has an eternal price. James had always been a man drawn to adventure. Even as a child, he would wander into the woods behind his home, exploring every creek, tree, and hidden path he could find. While other children played games or watched television, James was always seeking something more, something real, something that made his heart race and his mind curious. As he grew older, this curiosity developed into a passion for anthropology, the study of human cultures and their histories. He loved learning about how people lived, the stories they told, and the ways they connected with the land around them. By the time James graduated from university, he had already traveled to several countries, observing different tribes and communities. Yet, there was always a voice inside him telling him that he had not yet found the experience that would truly change him. That voice led him to the deserts of the American Southwest, where the Apache people had lived for centuries. He had read countless books about their traditions, their struggles, and their connection to the land, but he wanted more than words on a page. He wanted to feel it, to see it with his own eyes. The desert was vast, empty in the most breathtaking way. Its golden sands stretched for miles, broken only by jagged rocks and sparse shrubs. The sun hung low in the sky, turning the horizon into shades of orange, pink, and purple. James had always imagined deserts as hot and lifeless, but here, in the quiet stillness, he felt a strange peace. He set up his small camp near a dry riverbed, careful to leave the landscape as untouched as possible. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he would sit outside his tent, notebook in hand, recording observations and sketches of the land, the sky, and the few animals that ventured near. One late afternoon, as James was walking along a narrow canyon path, he heard laughter carried on the wind. It was soft and musical, unlike any sound he had expected to hear in the desert. Curious, he followed it until he reached a small clearing, where a few members of an Apache family were gathered. They were sitting around a low fire, roasting what appeared to be small pieces of food and talking quietly among themselves. James paused at the edge of the clearing, unsure if he should interrupt. He had been taught to respect boundaries, especially in cultures that were not his own. But before he could decide, a young woman stepped forward from the group. Her movements were graceful, almost like she was moving to a rhythm only she could hear. Her long, dark hair framed a face that was both strong and gentle, with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of many lifetimes. She carried a small, delicate flower in her hand. Without a word, she extended it toward James. He hesitated for only a moment before taking it, thinking it was a simple gesture of kindness. He smiled, trying to express gratitude, but as he did, he noticed the elders watching him closely. Their expressions were serious, almost cautious, though they did not say a word. James felt a strange warmth when he held the flower. It was more than just the touch of petals. It was as if the desert itself had lent its energy to the small bloom. The young woman, whose name he later learned was Nayeli, smiled softly at him, a look that was both welcoming and mysterious. He tried to speak, asking if he could stay and observe their gathering, but Nayeli only nodded slightly and gestured for him to sit a short distance away. James obeyed, careful not to intrude. He watched quietly as the family continued their evening routine, noticing how naturally they interacted with the environment. Each movement seemed deliberate, respectful, as if every action was a part of a greater harmony with the desert around them. As the night deepened, the stars began to shine brightly in the sky, more vivid than James had ever seen. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens, a river of light over the silent sands. The fire crackled, sending small sparks into the air, and the smell of smoke and earth filled James's senses. He felt a deep sense of awe, not just for the desert but for the people who had lived in it for generations, understanding it in ways he could barely begin to comprehend. Nayeli sat near the fire, occasionally glancing at him, her presence calming yet mysterious. There was an unspoken connection between them, something that James could not explain but felt in every part of his body. Over the next few days, James spent more time with Nayeli and her family. They taught him small things: how to find water hidden beneath the sand, how to read the tracks of animals, and how to listen to the wind for signs of change in the weather. Every lesson was simple yet profound, revealing a depth of knowledge that James realized could only come from living closely with the land for generations. Nayeli seemed to understand him in a way no one else ever had. She would often watch him as he sketched or took notes, her eyes calm and patient, as if she knew he was eager to learn but unaware of the deeper meanings behind everything he observed. James tried to ask about the flower he had accepted, hoping to understand its meaning. The elders responded vaguely, saying only that some gifts carry significance beyond what is visible. James laughed lightly, thinking it was a kind of poetic warning. He had accepted the flower out of courtesy, with no thought of consequences. Still, he could not shake the feeling that something had changed the moment he held it. At night, he began to dream vividly of the desert in ways that felt more real than his waking life. He would see endless dunes under a blood-red sunset, hear whispers of the wind, and sometimes catch glimpses of Nayeli's face, watching him from a distance. Each dream left him with a strange mixture of excitement and unease. One evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, Nayeli approached James quietly. She handed him another small flower, similar to the one he had received before, and simply said, "Respect the land, respect the gift." James nodded, unsure what she meant but sensing the importance of her words. That night he lay in his tent, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the desert, the tribe, and the mysterious young woman who had given him the flower. He realized that this journey was no longer just about research. It was about understanding something far larger than himself, a world of connection, respect, and perhaps consequences he could not yet see. James had always believed that adventure was about discovering new places and learning new things. Now, he was beginning to understand that true adventure might also mean discovering oneself, facing unknown challenges, and accepting that some experiences come with responsibilities that cannot be ignored. The desert was teaching him slowly that every action mattered and that the smallest gestures, like accepting a simple flower, could carry meaning far beyond what the eyes could see. By the end of that first week, James felt both exhilarated and unsettled. He had made a friend in Nayeli, learned the ways of the desert, and felt a bond with the land that he could not explain. Yet, a quiet part of him wondered if the elders had been trying to warn him all along. Something about the flower felt alive, almost as if it were a bridge connecting him to a life he had never known before. And though he could not fully understand it yet, James knew deep down that accepting the flower had set him on a path from which there might be no turning back. After that first week, James felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. The desert had begun to feel less like a distant adventure and more like a living entity that was quietly observing him. Each morning, he would wake before sunrise, the cold sand beneath his feet contrasting with the heat of the day that was yet to come. He would walk to the ridge of a nearby dune and watch as the sky changed colors, from deep indigo to pale pink, then golden yellow. In those moments, he felt small but alive, aware that the desert had its own rhythm, one that demanded respect and patience. Nayeli was often by his side during these early hours. She moved with ease, barefoot on the sand, her steps leaving delicate impressions that the wind would later erase. She did not speak much, but her presence was calming. James had begun to notice little things about her, the way her eyes seemed to see everything, the quiet strength in her movements, and the gentle way she cared for the plants and animals around them. She did not lecture or instruct. Instead, she guided him through example. James admired her patience and clarity, though he felt there was always something just beyond his understanding, something unspoken that hovered in the air whenever she was near. One afternoon, as James was examining a rare desert flower for his notes, he felt a sudden pull, almost like a tug in his chest. When he looked up, he saw Nayeli standing a short distance away, holding another flower, this one more vibrant than the last. "Take it," she said softly, "but remember, every gift carries meaning." James hesitated. He wanted to ask her what she meant, but he sensed that words would not fully explain it. The air around her seemed charged with energy, subtle yet undeniable, and he realized that this flower was not just a plant, but a symbol of something much larger, something connected to the land, the people, and perhaps even to him personally. Days turned into weeks, and James began to notice changes in himself. Small things at first, a heightened awareness of sounds, smells, and movements around him. He could feel the subtle shifts in wind, the way sand moved across the dunes, and even the quiet footsteps of animals long before he could see them. His dreams became vivid and strange. He would find himself walking through endless deserts, feeling the heat of the sun on his skin, hearing whispers that sounded almost like voices. Occasionally, he would catch glimpses of Nayeli, standing far away, watching him with a knowing look that made his heart race. The dreams were not frightening, but they were persistent, and he began to wake in the mornings with the lingering sense that the desert was trying to tell him something important. One evening, James asked Nayeli again about the flowers he had received. This time, she led him to a secluded area where the canyon walls rose high on either side, casting long shadows that seemed to move with the fading sunlight. She knelt down and picked a small handful of flowers from a hidden patch near a stream. "These flowers are not just gifts," she explained quietly. "They are bridges. They connect the heart of the giver to the one who receives. They are living reminders of trust, respect, and responsibility. To accept a flower is to accept a bond, one that cannot easily be broken." James listened intently, feeling a mix of awe and confusion. He had never thought of a flower in this way before. To him, it had been a simple gesture of kindness, but now he realized there was a depth he had not considered. Despite her explanation, James could not shake a sense of doubt. He wondered if perhaps he had misunderstood the meaning all along, or if he had unwittingly crossed a boundary he could not repair. At night, the dreams returned with greater intensity. He would walk through endless sand dunes, hearing whispers in a language he did not understand but somehow felt compelled to obey. In these visions, Nayeli's face would appear, calm and distant, and he would feel both a sense of longing and a weight of responsibility. He began to understand that this bond was not just symbolic, it was real, and it was affecting him in ways he could not yet fully grasp. During his stay, James also observed the tribe's daily life more closely. He saw how they moved in harmony with the land, hunting and gathering with respect, always careful not to take more than was needed. He noticed their quiet rituals, the stories they told around the fire, and the way they honored the spirits of the land. Each interaction carried a lesson, and James tried to absorb as much as he could. Nayeli's family treated him with polite curiosity, sometimes watching him with guarded eyes, as if they were assessing whether he was worthy of being in their presence. He felt both welcomed and tested, realizing that his actions, even small ones, were being observed closely. One afternoon, James witnessed a ceremony near the canyon's edge. The elders chanted softly, their voices blending with the wind as they moved gracefully among the gathered people. Nayeli was part of the ceremony, carrying flowers and offering them at specific moments. James watched in silence, understanding that this ritual was more than tradition. It was a way to maintain harmony with the world around them. He felt a deep respect for the culture he had entered, yet he also felt a growing unease. He sensed that his acceptance of the first flower had placed him on a path he could not turn back from, and the elders' serious glances from across the clearing reminded him that he was now part of something far larger than himself. As the days passed, James found it increasingly difficult to separate his thoughts from his dreams. The visions were no longer confined to the night. He would catch glimpses of the desert's endless sands even during the bright light of day. Shadows moved unnaturally, and the wind sometimes carried faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, he thought he was imagining it, perhaps letting his mind play tricks on him. But soon, he could not deny that something had changed. The flower he had accepted was no longer just a token. It was a living bond, and it demanded attention. James tried to discuss his feelings with Nayeli, but she would only smile gently and say, "The desert speaks to those who listen, and the flowers speak to those who feel. Be patient." Her words were comforting but cryptic, and he realized that he had to learn this lesson on his own. Over time, he began to pay attention not only to the desert but also to his own reactions, how he felt, what he dreamed, and the subtle shifts in his own heart. He started to see the world differently, noticing connections and patterns that he had never noticed before. The bond he had formed through the flower was teaching him awareness, patience, and respect in ways he could not have imagined. Despite the growing intensity of the experience, James felt a strong connection to Nayeli. She was both familiar and mysterious, a presence that guided him without controlling him. He respected her deeply and often found himself seeking her approval, even in small matters. Their relationship was quiet and understated, built on shared experiences rather than words. Yet James could feel the weight of the unspoken bond, the understanding that accepting the flower had intertwined his life with hers in a way that could not be undone. By the end of his second month in the desert, James had changed in ways he could barely describe. He moved with more awareness, observed with deeper focus, and felt the subtle rhythms of the desert as if they were part of his own body. He realized that the gift of the flower was not just about trust or friendship. It was about learning to live in harmony with forces larger than oneself. The desert, Nayeli, and the tribe had become teachers, showing him that even a single act of acceptance could carry profound meaning and lasting consequences. And yet, even with all he had learned, James could not shake the feeling that the true challenge was still ahead. The bond he had formed was growing stronger, pulling him toward a reality he could not yet see. He understood that the flower he had accepted had given him a doorway to something eternal, a connection to a world that moved slowly, deliberately, and with great care. And though he could not predict what lay ahead, he felt both fear and anticipation, knowing that his journey had only just begun. By the time James entered the third month of his stay in the desert, the experiences he had were no longer just unusual. They were becoming a part of his daily life. The bond created by accepting the first flower seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. At first, the changes were subtle. A shiver when the wind shifted, a sudden feeling of being watched, or an unexplainable tug in his chest whenever he thought of Nayeli. But gradually, these sensations became more intense, more difficult to ignore. He began to realize that this bond was not something temporary. It was something that had become a permanent part of him. James had always believed that he could explore, observe, and leave without leaving a part of himself behind. But now, he could feel that the desert, the tribe, and especially Nayeli had marked him in ways he could not yet comprehend. One morning, he awoke to find that the sand around his tent had shifted unusually, forming patterns he had never noticed before. Tiny footprints that were not his own appeared and disappeared as the wind blew, as if the desert itself were reminding him that he was no longer merely a visitor. A strange mix of awe and fear filled him. He began to understand that this place had its own rules he had unwittingly stepped into by accepting the flower. The dreams became impossible to ignore. Each night, James would see endless dunes under an orange sun, mountains of sand stretching further than he could imagine. Shadows moved in ways that defied logic, and whispers floated through the air in a language he did not understand but somehow instinctively felt. Sometimes, Naomi appeared in his dreams, standing silently on the horizon, her eyes calm yet piercing. He would try to approach her, but something invisible always prevented him. He woke each morning with a pounding heart, drenched in sweat, and a lingering sense that he was being drawn toward something far greater than himself. The dreams were no longer a source of curiosity, they were a warning. James tried to explain the dreams and feelings to Naomi, hoping she could provide guidance. One evening, as the desert sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, he approached her. "Naomi," he said cautiously, "I don't understand. I've accepted the flowers and now I feel something changing, something inside me. What is happening?" She looked at him quietly, her dark eyes reflecting the fiery sky. "You accepted the flower," she said softly. "It is not just a gift, it is a bond, it is a responsibility. You are connected to the land, the tribe, and me in a way that cannot be undone. The deeper you feel it, the more it will shape your life." James nodded slowly, but even as he tried to understand, he felt a sense of dread creeping in. It was one thing to accept a gift, but it was another to realize that every action, every thought, and every feeling might now be influenced by forces he did not fully comprehend. He began to notice strange events in the daylight as well. Shadows would flicker at the edge of his vision, objects in his tent would seem slightly moved, and he often felt as though invisible eyes were following him. The desert that had once felt peaceful now carried a constant hum of energy, almost like a heartbeat. One afternoon, while exploring a narrow canyon, James stumbled upon an ancient circle of stones. The arrangement was intricate, with markings etched into each rock. As he examined them, he felt a sudden chill, though the sun was high and the air was hot. He knelt to touch the stones, and in that instant he felt a surge of energy, almost like electricity running through his body. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of flowers, and in the distance he thought he heard Naomi calling his name. It was clear now, this was no ordinary place, no ordinary experience. The bond from the flower was awakening something ancient, something beyond ordinary understanding. James began to see patterns in everything around him. The way the sand shifted with the wind, the manner in which the plants grew, the precise movements of animals, all seemed to follow a rhythm he had not noticed before. At first, he tried to ignore these realizations, fearing that he was losing his mind. But the more he resisted, the stronger the connection became. It was as if the flower had opened a door to a deeper understanding of the world, one that required him to see beyond the ordinary. He could feel it pulling him toward the desert's secrets, toward truths he had never imagined. Despite the growing intensity, James could not deny the strange comfort he felt in Naomi's presence. She was the constant in this shifting reality, her calm demeanor and gentle guidance offering him balance. Yet, there was also a sense of warning in her eyes, a reminder that this connection had a cost. She never said the word eternal, but he understood it implicitly. Accepting the flower had bound him to the tribe, to the land, and to Naomi herself. There was no going back. The realization filled him with a mixture of fear and fascination. As the days passed, James began to feel the social distance between himself and the rest of the world. Letters and messages from friends and family went unanswered. Their voices, though familiar, felt distant, as if he were no longer part of their reality. The desert had become his center, and the bond he carried with him through the flower had begun to reshape his life. Each dream, each vision, each strange occurrence was a reminder that he had entered a world where ordinary rules no longer applied. One night, James had a particularly vivid dream. He was walking across a desert that stretched beyond the horizon, the sky glowing red with the setting sun. In the distance, Nayeli stood on a high dune, her face calm and welcoming. But as he approached, shadows rose from the sand, forming shapes he could not recognize. They whispered in a language he did not understand, yet their meaning was clear. He had entered a realm that demanded respect, patience, and awareness. The dream left him trembling, and when he woke, he felt the weight of the bond heavier than ever. He understood now that this was no ordinary connection. It was a responsibility that would shape the rest of his life. The elders of the tribe began to observe him more closely during this period. They would watch him silently, their eyes calm but attentive, as if noting every word, every gesture, and every thought. James felt both honored and nervous under their scrutiny. He realized that the bond he had formed through the flower was not just personal. It was recognized by the tribe, acknowledged by those who understood the ancient ways of the land. Their silent approval, or perhaps caution, reminded him that his actions now mattered far more than they ever had before. James also noticed a change in his perception of time. Days blended together in a rhythm dictated by the desert itself, the movement of the sun, the shifting of the sand, the wind's gentle whisper. He began to feel the past and future as though they were layered on top of the present. Memories of his life before the desert felt distant, almost like a dream he had once known. The bond he carried had altered not just his body or senses, but his mind and spirit. He was becoming a part of the desert's rhythm, a participant in a story far older than he could imagine. In quiet moments, James reflected on the choice he had made when he first accepted the flower. At the time, it had seemed simple, even innocent. But now, he understood that this small gesture had changed everything. It had connected him to a world he barely understood, tied him to forces both powerful and ancient, and introduced him to responsibilities he could not ignore. Fear mixed with awe, curiosity mixed with respect, and he realized that his life would never be the same. The flower had bound him to a path that would shape not just his experiences in the desert, but the way he would perceive and interact with the world forever. By the end of this period, James had become both stronger and more vulnerable. He had gained insight into the desert, the tribe, and the subtle energies around him, yet he also carried the weight of the unknown. The bond had grown so powerful that he could no longer see where he ended and where the desert, or Nayeli, began. Every thought, every action, every dream was now connected to something greater than himself. He realized that the eternal price of the flower was not a punishment, but a responsibility, a commitment to live in awareness, respect, and connection with forces that most people would never notice or understand. And so, as James walked along the desert ridges each morning, feeling the wind and listening to the whispers of the sand, he knew one thing with certainty: his life had changed forever. The bond created by the flower had begun to guide him, challenge him, and transform him in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. The price he was paying was real, yet it was also a gift that would teach him lessons about respect, awareness, and the unseen connections that shape the world. As the months in the desert passed, James began to feel the full weight of the bond he had unknowingly accepted. The flower had tied him to a world that moved at a rhythm entirely different from the one he had known before. Each day, the desert seemed to grow more alive, the sand shifting in subtle patterns that hinted at unseen forces. The wind would carry soft whispers that felt like voices, though he could not understand the language. Sometimes he could see faint shapes in the distance, shadows that seemed to watch him, vanish and reappear. He realized that he could no longer separate his own reality from the desert's rhythm. They had merged into one. Nayeli remained a quiet guide in all of this. She did not explain everything, for she understood that some lessons could only be learned through experience. James often watched her from a distance, admiring how naturally she moved through the desert, her feet barely disturbing the sand. Her presence was calming, yet it also reminded him constantly of the responsibility he carried. He had accepted the flower and in doing so had accepted a connection that could not be undone. Sometimes, late at night, he would catch himself staring at the stars, thinking of her, and feeling the pull of the bond stretching across the distance between them. The elders began to involve him more in the tribe's rituals. He watched as they performed ceremonies to honor the desert, the animals, and the spirits of the land. James observed quietly at first, unsure of how to participate without making a mistake. But gradually, he began to understand their purpose, not as entertainment or mere tradition, but as a way to maintain balance and harmony with forces beyond human comprehension. Each ceremony seemed to resonate deeply with him, stirring emotions and sensations that he had never experienced. The bond from the flower had opened his perception, allowing him to feel and see things that others might overlook. One afternoon, as he walked along the ridge of a high dune, James felt a sudden and powerful pull in his chest. The air around him seemed to hum with energy, and the temperature shifted, making the sand beneath his feet feel warmer than usual. He followed the feeling, climbing the dune until he reached the top, where he saw a vision unfold before him. The desert stretched endlessly, as if he were standing at the edge of time itself. Shapes appeared in the sand, figures moving gracefully, forming patterns that felt alive. At the center stood Naeli, holding a flower that glowed faintly in the sunlight. James felt an intense mixture of awe and fear. He understood in that instant that the bond had matured, becoming a living part of the desert itself. James began to see that the eternal price was not simply a warning, it was a truth he could not escape. The bond was demanding that he act with responsibility, respect, and awareness at all times. Every thought, every decision, every action mattered in ways he had never imagined. He noticed that small mistakes in his behavior, moving carelessly, speaking too loudly, or taking more than needed from the land, would result in subtle disturbances. Sand would shift oddly, animals would scatter, and even the wind seemed to respond to his missteps. The flower had created a connection not only to Naeli but to the desert itself, and it was teaching him lessons about balance, humility, and the consequences of human action. At night, James continued to have vivid dreams, but they had grown more intense. He would walk through endless dunes, encountering figures that seemed neither human nor spirit, moving in patterns that carried messages he could not fully comprehend. Sometimes Naeli would appear to guide him, her eyes calm but serious, pointing toward paths that seemed impossible to navigate. He began to feel that the dreams were not just visions, they were lessons, exercises to strengthen his understanding and his bond with the desert. They were preparing him for challenges he could not yet see, challenges that would test both his courage and his wisdom. Despite the increasing intensity of the experiences, James felt himself growing stronger. His mind became sharper, his senses more acute, and his understanding of the desert and its creatures deeper. He could sense the subtle movements of animals, feel the shift of the wind long before it arrived, and even detect small changes in the patterns of the sand. The desert was no longer a distant landscape. It had become a teacher, a guide, and a mirror reflecting his own thoughts and feelings. He began to appreciate that the flower had given him this gift, the ability to see beyond the ordinary, to understand connections that others might never notice. However, this growth was accompanied by moments of deep fear and doubt. James realized that the bond could not be broken. There was no turning back to the life he had known before. Family, friends, and the familiar comforts of city life began to feel distant and irrelevant. He could no longer experience the world in the same way as before. His perceptions had been permanently altered. The desert, Naeli, and the flower were now central to his life, and with this realization came a weight of responsibility he could not ignore. He understood that he was now a custodian of the bond, a participant in a story far older and greater than himself. One day, while exploring a hidden canyon, James encountered a natural spring surrounded by vibrant vegetation, a stark contrast to the arid sands of the surrounding desert. As he approached, he noticed that the plants around the water moved slightly, as if acknowledging his presence. The energy of the place was palpable. Naomi appeared beside him, silent, watching as he knelt to observe the life around the spring. "Every gift has meaning," she said softly. "Every bond has responsibility. You are learning what it means to carry both." James felt the truth of her words deep in his heart. The flower had given him more than a connection. It had given him insight into the delicate balance of life, teaching him that every action, no matter how small, could have lasting effects. As the days turned into weeks, James found that the bond required more than awareness. It demanded acceptance. He could no longer resist or try to control the experiences. It was a part of his life now, and he needed to embrace it fully. He began to integrate his understanding into daily routines, walking with care, speaking with intention, and observing the desert with heightened attention. Every sunrise, every star in the night sky, and every whisper of the wind became a lesson. The flower had changed him, but rather than seeing this as a burden, he began to recognize it as a gift that would guide his life forever. James also learned the importance of patience. The desert moved slowly, deliberately, teaching him that understanding and wisdom cannot be rushed. Small gestures, like tending to plants or observing animals without disturbing them, became acts of meditation and reflection. Naomi's presence reminded him to honor the rhythm of the land and the spirits that resided within it. The bond demanded respect for both the seen and unseen worlds, and James felt that he was growing into a deeper understanding of life itself. Despite the clarity he was gaining, there were moments of struggle. The bond sometimes brought overwhelming sensations, emotions he could not name, and visions that left him disoriented. Shadows in the sand would shift unnaturally, whispers would rise in the wind, and sometimes Naomi would appear with a serious expression, silently reminding him that the lessons were ongoing. He realized that the eternal nature of the bond meant that he could not escape its influence. The flower had woven itself into the fabric of his life, shaping his experiences, perceptions, and even his dreams. By the end of this period, James had changed in ways that were both visible and invisible. His posture, his movements, and his speech carried a new calm and confidence. But internally, he carried the weight of knowledge and awareness that few could comprehend. He understood now that the bond required a lifetime of dedication, mindfulness, and respect. The flower had connected him to Naomi, the tribe, and the desert itself, creating an intricate web of relationships and responsibilities. The eternal price was no longer a fear. It was a guide, teaching him how to live in harmony with forces greater than himself. And so James continued to walk the desert each day, feeling the pull of the wind, observing the patterns of the sand, and listening to the whispers of the unseen world. Naomi was always near, guiding, watching, and teaching without words. The flower had given him a bond that could not be broken, but it had also given him insight, wisdom, and a deep sense of purpose. James understood that his life would never return to what it had been, and he accepted that fully. The eternal price was real, but it was also a gift, a responsibility that would shape his life, his choices, and his understanding of the world forever. By the time James reached the final stage of his journey, he had come to understand the full weight and depth of the bond he had formed by accepting the flower. It had been months since he first arrived in the desert, yet the lessons he had learned had transformed him in ways he could not have imagined. The desert was no longer a distant place for adventure. It had become a living teacher, shaping his thoughts, feelings, and even the way he moved through the world. Naeli remained by his side, both in presence and spirit, guiding him quietly and reminding him of the responsibility he carried. James had grown in patience, awareness, and understanding. Each morning he would rise before the sun and walk among the dunes, noticing the smallest details, the way shadows shifted across the sand, the subtle tracks of animals, and the gentle sway of desert plants. Every movement, every sound, and every breath carried meaning. He had learned to listen to the wind, to watch the clouds, and to feel the rhythm of the land. The bond had heightened his senses and opened his mind to the interconnectedness of all life. It had taught him that nothing existed in isolation, and that every action, no matter how small, had an effect on the world around him. At night, the dreams that had once been confusing and disorienting became a source of guidance. James would walk through vast, endless landscapes of sand, following paths that seemed impossible in the waking world. Shadows moved in intricate patterns, and he began to recognize the figures in these visions as guides, teachers, and reminders of the responsibilities he had accepted. Naeli appeared frequently, her face calm and encouraging, showing him the paths he needed to take. These dreams were no longer frightening. They were lessons, providing insight into the unseen forces of the desert and the lives that had existed there long before him. The elders of the tribe had also begun to acknowledge James in a new way. They no longer treated him merely as a visitor or student. He was becoming a participant in their long-standing traditions. They included him in ceremonies that honored the spirits of the land, the animals, and the ancestors. James observed with reverence, realizing that these rituals were not just symbolic. They were a means of maintaining balance, respect, and harmony with the world. Through his bond with the flower, he had become a part of this cycle, connected to forces and responsibilities that extended far beyond his own understanding. One morning, James walked to a high ridge overlooking the desert, where the sun painted the sands in gold and orange. He stood silently, feeling the wind on his face, and sensed a profound connection to the land, Naeli, and the tribe. The desert was alive with energy, and he could feel the echoes of centuries past flowing through the dunes. Every ripple of sand, every whisper of wind, seemed to communicate a message he could now understand. He realized that the eternal price of the flower had never been punishment. It was awareness, connection, and understanding. It was a responsibility to live fully, mindfully, and with respect for the forces greater than himself. As the days continued, James began to see the deeper purpose of the bond. It was not simply about lessons in patience, respect, or observation. It was about transformation, about becoming a person who could carry the knowledge, insight, and wisdom of the desert into the wider world. He understood that the gift of the flower had connected him to a lineage of people and spirits who had walked the land long before him, and would continue to do so long after. By accepting the flower, he had joined this unbroken chain, carrying forward the understanding that life, nature, and spirit are inseparable. James also recognized the impact of his transformation on his own life. He no longer thought of himself merely as an anthropologist, an observer, or a traveler. He had become a part of the desert's story, a living bridge between the world he had known and the world he had been drawn into. His experiences had taught him humility, patience, and courage. He realized that the true meaning of the flower was not just a bond with Naeli. It was a call to live intentionally, to honor every living thing, and to respect the unseen forces that shape life. One evening, as the sky turned deep purple and the first stars appeared, James and Naeli stood together on a dune. The desert stretched endlessly before them, silent yet alive. He felt a deep sense of peace and understanding, recognizing that he was no longer alone in the world. The bond of the flower had given him connection, insight, and a sense of purpose he could never have imagined. Naomi's presence reminded him that the bond was eternal, not in the sense of imprisonment, but in the sense of responsibility, awareness, and growth. It was a connection that would guide him for the rest of his life, shaping his actions, thoughts, and dreams. In the following weeks, James began to document his experiences, not as a detached observer, but as someone fully immersed in the world he had entered. His notes and sketches captured not only the physical beauty of the desert, but also the invisible currents of energy, connection, and life that he had come to understand. He wrote of the subtle whispers in the wind, the patterns of the sand, the rituals of the tribe, and the lessons he had learned from Naomi and the elders. Each page reflected not only what he had seen, but also what he had felt, providing a record of transformation that would guide others who sought to understand the deeper connections of life. As James prepared to leave the desert for the first time since his journey began, he realized that he could never truly separate himself from it. The bond of the flower had woven itself into his being, linking him forever to the land, the tribe, and Naomi. He understood that leaving physically did not mean leaving spiritually. The connection was eternal, guiding him in all his thoughts, dreams, and actions. The desert, once a distant adventure, had become a living part of him, shaping the man he had become and would continue to be. Before departing, James stood once more with Naomi at the edge of the dunes. "I understand now," he said quietly. "The flower, it was never just a gift. It was a responsibility, and I am ready to carry it no matter where I go." Naomi smiled, her eyes calm yet full of wisdom. "You have learned well," she replied. "The bond is eternal, but it is also a guide. Remember what you have seen, what you have felt, and what you have learned. Live with awareness, and you will honor it." James nodded, feeling a sense of completion and purpose he had never experienced before. Even as he left the desert behind, James carried the lessons, visions, and bond with him. Every landscape he encountered, every person he met, and every choice he made was now touched by the understanding he had gained. The flower had given him an eternal connection, not of chains or punishment, but of insight, awareness, and respect. He realized that this was the true gift, the ability to live with understanding, to honor the unseen forces around him, and to recognize that every action matters. In the years that followed, James shared his experiences, not as fantastical tales, but as stories of transformation, respect, and awareness. He spoke of the desert, the tribe, and the bond of the flower as a reminder that life is interconnected, and that even the smallest gestures can carry profound meaning. His time in the desert had changed him completely. It had shown him that the world is alive in ways most people never notice, and that accepting gifts, however small, comes with responsibilities that last a lifetime. James never forgot the desert, Naomi, or the flower. Even in distant cities and foreign lands, he would feel the subtle pull of the bond, a quiet reminder that he was part of something larger than himself. The eternal price had not been a burden, it had been a guide, a teacher, and a connection that transformed his life forever. He had entered the desert as a curious traveler, seeking knowledge, but he left as a man deeply aware of the unseen threads that connect all life. The flower had given him a bond that would last for eternity, shaping every thought, every action, and every dream for the rest of his life. And so James walked through the world with new eyes, carrying the wisdom of the desert, the guidance of Naomi, and the eternal connection of the flower. The price had been real, yet it was also a gift that taught him that some bonds are not meant to be broken, some lessons are not meant to be ignored, and that the true meaning of life is found in connection, awareness, and respect for the unseen forces that shape everything around us. The desert had given him its eternal lesson, and James had learned it fully.